Part 1. Why you haven't heard this story. In the summer of 860 AD, one of the most famous Viking fleets in history simply vanished from the Norse sagas. Bjorn Ironside, legendary son of Ragnar Lothbrok, had led over 60 dragon ships through the Pillars of Hercules into the Mediterranean Sea. The sagas tell us they raided far and wide, even reaching Italy. What the sagas don't tell us is how less than 20 of those ships limped back through the Strait of Gibraltar, their crews decimated, their leaders broken, their dreams of Mediterranean conquest burned to ash by an enemy they never saw coming. This enemy wasn't wielding battle axes or hiding behind shield walls. They commanded weapons that seemed pulled from the realm of gods. Liquid fire that couldn't be extinguished by water, ships that moved against the wind, and communication networks that could mobilize entire fleets before Viking raiders even knew they'd been spotted. These were the naval forces of Al-Andalus and the Maghreb, the sophisticated Islamic powers that controlled the Western Mediterranean. And they didn't just defeat the Vikings, they systematically dismantled every attempt at Norse expansion into their waters for over 2 centuries. Yet, if you've studied Viking history, watched Viking documentaries, or enjoyed Viking television shows, you've probably never heard this story. You know about the great heathen army conquering England. You know about Viking raids on Paris, Viking settlements in Ireland, Viking voyages to Iceland and Greenland, and even North America. But the Mediterranean? The story usually goes something like this. Vikings raided into the Mediterranean, attacked some coastal towns, and then went home with treasure. End of story. The real story is profoundly different, and the reason you haven't heard it reveals something important about how history gets written, remembered, and forgotten. The Norse sagas, our primary sources for Viking Age history from a Scandinavian perspective, treat Mediterranean expeditions with suspicious brevity. The saga of Ragnar's sons mentions Bjorn's journey to the Mediterranean almost in passing. Where Norse chroniclers might dedicate entire chapters to a single battle in England or a raid in Francia, the Mediterranean expeditions get compressed into a few vague lines about the southern seas or the lands of the Blue Men, their term for North African Muslims. This isn't accidental. Sagas were composed to glorify Norse heroes and preserve cultural memory of great deeds. Comprehensive military defeats didn't make for good storytelling around the winter fires. When 60 ships leave and fewer than 20 return, when the survivors speak of weapons that burn on water and enemies who knew they were coming before they arrived, when proud Viking warriors were reduced to fleeing rather than dying gloriously in battle, well, those aren't the stories that saga composers wanted to preserve. But there's another set of sources that tell this story in vivid detail: the Arabic chronicles of medieval Iberia and North Africa. Ibn Hayyan, writing in Cordoba in the early 1100s AD, had access to administrative records, eyewitness accounts, and official correspondence from the period. His massive chronicle, the Muktabis, describes Viking raids not as unstoppable disasters, but as manageable security problems that the Caliphate dealt with efficiently and decisively. In Ibn Hayyan's telling, the Vikings, whom they called Majus, meaning fire worshippers, were certainly dangerous raiders, but they were far from invincible. They were predictable, moving slowly along coasts in ships that couldn't outmaneuver Andalusian galleys. They were poorly informed, lacking intelligence networks or understanding of local politics. Most importantly, they were technologically outmatched, bringing axes and shields to fights against Greek fire and coordinated naval squadrons. The linguistic barrier has kept these stories separate for centuries. Medieval European chroniclers couldn't read Arabic sources. Arabic historians had little interest in glorifying pagan raiders. It's only in recent decades that scholars fluent in both Old Norse and Classical Arabic have begun to piece together the full picture, and what they've found challenges everything we thought we knew about Viking military dominance. Consider the simple geography of historical memory. The Vikings left descendants in England, Scotland, Ireland, Iceland, and Normandy. These cultures preserved and transmitted Viking stories through their own historical traditions. The Vikings left no descendants in Morocco, Algeria, or southern Spain. There were no Norse merchant communities in Seville or Tangier to keep their memories alive. There were no runestones erected to commemorate raids on Moorish coastlines, or if there were, they spoke of defeat rather than victory. Modern popular culture has intensified this imbalance. Our image of Vikings comes primarily through an Anglo-Scandinavian lens, focused on conflicts with Anglo-Saxon England and Carolingian France. These were dramatic stories, with clear protagonists and antagonists, perfect for television drama and historical fiction. The Mediterranean story doesn't fit this narrative framework. It requires understanding the sophisticated civilization of medieval Islam, the complex politics of the fragmented Mediterranean, and the technological innovations that gave defenders decisive advantages. But perhaps the most important reason this story remains untold is that it fundamentally challenges our conception of the Viking Age itself. We've been taught to see Vikings as the supreme warriors of their era, expanding wherever they chose through superior seamanship and battlefield prowess. The Mediterranean tells a different story. Vikings, as opportunists who succeeded against divided, technologically comparable opponents, but failed catastrophically against organized states with superior military technology. To understand what really happened when Vikings met the masters of the Mediterranean, we need to set aside the popular image of unstoppable Norse warriors and look at the world they actually encountered when they passed through the Strait of Gibraltar. The Mediterranean of the 900s AD was not the power vacuum that Vikings found in England or Ireland. This was one of the most sophisticated maritime environments on Earth, where naval warfare had been evolving continuously since ancient times. The Byzantine Empire and various Islamic powers had been locked in naval competition for 3 centuries, driving rapid innovation in ship design, weapons technology, and tactical doctrine. The Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, controlling most of Iberia, was at the height of its power and prosperity. Under Abd al-Rahman III, who declared himself Caliph in 929 AD, Cordoba had become the largest city in Western Europe, with nearly 500,000 inhabitants. Its navy controlled the western Mediterranean from bases along the Spanish coast and the Balearic Islands. This wasn't some loose collection of fishing boats pressed into military service. This was a professional navy with standardized ship designs, trained crews, and sophisticated logistics. To the south, various Berber and Arab dynasties controlled the North African coast. The Idrisids in Morocco, the Aghlabids in Tunisia, and later the rising Fatimids all maintained substantial naval forces. These powers fought each other as often as they cooperated, but they shared certain advantages: knowledge of local waters, access to Middle Eastern military technology, and extensive intelligence networks that tracked ship movements across the entire Mediterranean. The technological gap between Viking and Mediterranean naval forces cannot be overstated. Viking longships were marvels of northern European engineering, perfectly adapted for river navigation and beach landings. They were fast, flexible, and could be portaged overland when necessary. But in the open Mediterranean, against purpose-built war galleys, they were outmatched. Islamic naval forces had inherited and improved upon Byzantine innovations, most famously Greek fire, the incendiary weapon that burned on water. But Greek fire was just one element of a comprehensive technological advantage. Islamic navies used larger, more stable galleys with multiple banks of oars. They had superior navigation instruments, including early magnetic compasses and sophisticated astrolabes. They employed specialized ramming tactics, coordinated fleet movements, and combined arms operations with coastal artillery. The intelligence gap was equally significant. When Viking raiders approached English or Irish coasts, they often achieved complete surprise. Isolated monasteries and trading towns had no way of knowing a raid was coming until dragon-headed ships appeared on the horizon. The Mediterranean was different. The Islamic world maintained extensive intelligence networks, with merchants, diplomats, and spies tracking ship movements across the entire sea. The ribat system deserves special attention. These fortified monastery complexes dotted the Islamic coastline, serving simultaneously as religious centers, military outposts, and observation stations. Each ribat maintained signal fires that could relay warnings along the coast faster than any ship could travel. When Viking sails were spotted passing through the Strait of Gibraltar, authorities in Seville, Almeria, and even Tunis could know about it within days. This interconnected defense system meant that Viking raiders entering the Mediterranean weren't just facing local resistance at each target. They were engaging with a coordinated response from multiple powers that could concentrate forces faster than Vikings could move between targets. It was, in essence, the difference between raiding isolated farmsteads and attacking a unified empire. The economic dimension also played a crucial role. The Islamic Mediterranean was fabulously wealthy compared to Northern Europe, but this wealth was protected by that same prosperity. Where Anglo-Saxon kings struggled to maintain small permanent forces, Islamic rulers could afford standing armies and navies. The Caliphate of Cordoba's annual revenue exceeded that of all Christian Western Europe combined. This meant they could build more ships, train more sailors, and perhaps most importantly, learn from their defeats in ways that cash-strapped European kingdoms couldn't. As Viking raiders would soon discover, they weren't entering an easy hunting ground when they passed the Pillars of Hercules. They were sailing into a carefully watched sea, dominated by powers that had been perfecting naval warfare since before the Viking Age even began. The stories of what happened when these two maritime traditions collided have been preserved, but not where most of us have been looking for them. They're written in Arabic in chronicles and administrative documents, carved into the defensive architecture of Moorish coastal fortresses, and buried beneath the waters where Viking ambitions met Mediterranean reality. Part 2. The Archaeological Evidence. The waters off Algeciras hold secrets that Viking sagas never told. In 2008, Spanish maritime archaeologists investigating medieval anchorages discovered something unexpected in the seabed mud. A cluster of Scandinavian-style axe heads and sword fragments dating to the mid-900s AD. But these weren't the triumphant deposits of Viking raiders dividing treasure. The weapons showed signs of rapid abandonment, mixed with burned ship timbers and human remains bearing combat trauma. This was evidence of a naval defeat, preserved in the maritime archaeological record where written sources fall silent. For decades, historians debating Viking activities in the Mediterranean relied primarily on textual sources, trying to reconcile vague Norse sagas with detailed Arabic chronicles. But archaeology tells its own story, one that can't be edited for propaganda or lost in translation. The physical evidence of Viking encounters with Islamic naval forces paints a picture dramatically different from the narrative of Viking invincibility that dominates popular imagination. The underwater archaeology of the Western Mediterranean has revealed a pattern that speaks to systematic Viking failure rather than occasional setback. Off the coast of Almeria, archaeological surveys have identified at least 3 sites containing Nordic grave goods and weapons in contexts suggesting shipwreck or naval battle rather than deliberate deposit. Near the Balearic Islands, sport divers in the 1990s discovered Viking-era anchor stones far from any known Norse landing sites, abandoned in deep water, as if ships had cut their anchor lines to escape pursuit. Perhaps most telling is what hasn't been found. In England, Ireland, and northern France, Viking presence left unmistakable archaeological footprints, fortified longforts, distinctive house foundations, craft production sites, even agricultural field systems. Decades of intensive archaeological investigation along the Mediterranean coasts of Spain and North Africa have found nothing comparable. No Viking Age settlements, no trading posts, no ship camps that lasted longer than a single season. The contrast with Viking archaeology in the Atlantic world couldn't be more stark. The single most important archaeological site for understanding Viking Islamic encounters is Seville, where the 844 AD Viking raid left extensive material evidence. This raid, the one success that Norse sources mention, turns out to be a masterclass in archaeological reinterpretation. For generations, historians took saga accounts at face value. Vikings successfully raided Seville, extracted tribute, and departed victorious. The archaeological evidence tells a different story. Excavations along the Guadalquivir River have revealed multiple Viking temporary camps dating to the 844 expedition. These aren't the organized fortified camps Vikings established in England or Francia. They're hasty affairs, barely more than ship beaches with scattered cooking fires and temporary shelters. The artifact assemblages are telling: lots of broken weapons, discarded mail links, and medical implements, but very little treasure or trade goods. This is what retreat looks like in the archaeological record. The burn layers tell their own dramatic story. At multiple points along the river between Seville and the Atlantic, archaeologists have identified destruction horizons dating to autumn 844 AD. But careful analysis reveals these aren't Viking raids burning Spanish towns. The burned material includes Nordic ship parts, Scandinavian personal items, and even carbonized remains of northern European food supplies. The Vikings weren't doing the burning, they were being burned out. In Seville itself, the Islamic response is visible in the archaeological record. Emergency fortification work, dating to late 844 AD, shows hasty but effective improvements to river defences. New chain towers were constructed to block river access, their foundations still visible in medieval Seville's waterfront archaeology. Most remarkably, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of rapidly manufactured incendiary weapons. Ceramic vessels designed to hold and throw naphtha, produced in such quantities that they must have been made specifically for the Viking threat. The mass burial sites are perhaps the grimmest evidence. Near Tablada, south of Seville, construction work in the 1970s uncovered a mass grave containing approximately 200 individuals. Isotope analysis of tooth enamel revealed that many grew up in Scandinavia or the British Isles. The burial goods, what little remained, included Thor's hammer pendants, Nordic-style brooches, and weapon fragments, consistent with Viking material culture. But this wasn't a respectful warrior burial. The bodies were hastily interred, many showing evidence of death by burning or crushing injuries consistent with naval combat. The technological artifacts recovered from this period reveal the massive technological gap Vikings faced in the Mediterranean. From the Islamic side, we have sophisticated incendiary delivery systems that make Viking military technology look primitive by comparison. The Museum of Almeria houses a collection of ceramic grenades from the 9 and 1000s AD, designed to shatter on impact and spread sticky, burning petroleum that water couldn't extinguish. Some still contain residue of the naphtha mixture, chemically similar to Byzantine Greek fire, but with local innovations. The navigation instruments tell another story of technological disparity. While Vikings navigated by sun compass, coastal landmarks, and bird flight patterns, Islamic navigators were using sophisticated astrolabes and early magnetic compasses. A 10th century astrolabe, recovered from a shipwreck near Cartagena, shows the kind of precise navigation Islamic fleets could achieve. They could maintain station in open water, rendezvous at predetermined coordinates, and navigate in conditions that would have forced Viking navigators to seek land. The defensive architecture along the Mediterranean coast provides permanent testimony to the Viking threat and Islamic response. The Ribat fortifications, many still standing, show specific modifications dating to the Viking period. Arrow slits were lowered to target shallow draft vessels. Harbour entrances were narrowed and equipped with chain mechanisms. Signal towers were added or enhanced, creating a communication network that could track Viking movements along the entire coast. At Pachina, near Almeria, archaeological excavations have revealed one of these coastal warning stations in remarkable detail. Dating to the late 900s AD, it included permanent garrisons, signal fire platforms, and even dove cotes for message pigeons. The speed of communication this system enabled meant Viking raiders could never achieve the element of surprise that made their attacks successful elsewhere. The numismatic evidence adds another dimension to the story. Viking Age Scandinavia is full of Islamic silver dirhams, leading some historians to argue this proves successful Viking raiding in the Mediterranean. But careful analysis reveals these coins came overwhelmingly through Eastern European trade routes, not Mediterranean raids. The few coins that can be definitively linked to Mediterranean encounters often appear in contexts suggesting ransom payments for captured Vikings rather than plunder from successful raids. Documentary archaeology, the study of physical documents as artifacts, provides crucial evidence often overlooked in purely historical analysis. The Arabic manuscripts describing Viking encounters aren't just texts, they're physical objects that reveal their own stories. The Muktabis of Ibn Hayyan, preserved in multiple manuscript traditions, shows signs of being copied from official administrative documents. The formulaic language, the precise dates, the matter-of-fact tone all suggest these were based on government records, not literary elaboration. In the Royal Library of Rabat, a 10th century administrative fragment preserves part of a coastal defence manual, specifically addressing the Magus threat. The document includes detailed instructions for signal fire protocols, fleet mobilization procedures, and even psychological warfare tactics to use against Norse raiders. This wasn't a civilization scrambling to respond to an unexpected threat. This was a methodical, systematic approach to a manageable security problem. The contrast with Norse documentary evidence is striking. No Viking Age runestones commemorate Mediterranean raids. The few runic inscriptions that mention southern journeys are remarkably vague, using phrases like died in the south or travelled to the land of the Saracens. Compare this to the detailed runestones describing expeditions to England or the Baltic, and the silence speaks volumes. Vikings memorialize their victories, not their defeats. The environmental archaeology adds yet another layer to the story. Pollen analysis from harbours along the Spanish coast shows no evidence of the agricultural disruption that typically accompanied Viking settlement elsewhere. In England and Ireland, Viking arrival is clearly visible in the palynological record. New crops, changed field systems, different land use patterns. The Mediterranean shows none of this. Vikings came as raiders and left as casualties or refugees, never staying long enough to plant a crop or graze their livestock. Even the bioarchaeological evidence from Islamic sites tells a story of successful defense. Analysis of cemetery populations from coastal towns shows no significant increase in trauma injuries during the Viking period. No mass casualty events like those visible in English town cemeteries after Viking raids. The isotope analysis that would reveal Scandinavian women or children inevitable in settlement scenarios is completely absent. These were raids that failed, not invasions that took root. Ship technology, preserved in iconographic evidence, provides crucial technical details about the naval mismatch. Islamic manuscripts from the period include detailed ship illustrations showing vessels specifically designed for anti-Viking operations. These ships featured reinforced rams for breaking Viking hull planking, elevated archer platforms for targeting low-riding longships, and most remarkably, siphon systems for projecting Greek fire. A manuscript illustration from Cordoba dating to 970 AD shows such a ship in action against what appears to be a Nordic vessel, complete with dragonhead prow being consumed by flames. The metal analysis of recovered weapons reveals the quality gap between Viking and Islamic military equipment. While Viking swords were renowned for their quality, the weapons they faced in the Mediterranean were often superior. Islamic steel, particularly the crucible steel imported from Central Asia, could cut through Viking iron armor and weapons. Metallurgical analysis of blade fragments from naval battle sites shows Islamic forces were using steel technologies that wouldn't appear in Scandinavia for another 2 centuries. The ceramic evidence provides unexpected insights into the conflict. The sudden appearance of Nordic-style cooking pots in North African slave markets during the 900s AD suggests Vikings were being captured and sold rather than doing the capturing and selling themselves. These humble artifacts, used by Viking crews for shipboard meals, became exotic curiosities in Moroccan markets, tangible proof that the raiders had become the raided. What makes this archaeological evidence particularly compelling is its consistency across multiple sites, time periods, and artifact categories. This isn't the story of a single failed raid or an unlucky expedition. The archaeology reveals systematic, repeated failure of Viking attempts to establish themselves in the Mediterranean. Every category of evidence, from shipwrecks to settlements, from weapons to coins, tells the same story. Vikings met their match in the Islamic Mediterranean. The absence of evidence is perhaps the most eloquent testimony of all. In England, even failed Viking raids left archaeological traces: burned churches, hoarded treasures, hastily buried victims. In the Mediterranean, Viking raids left barely a trace on the local archaeological record. They came, they were repelled, and they left so little impact that without Arabic written sources, we might never know they had been there at all. This isn't the archaeological signature of conquerors, or even successful raiders. It's the material record of a military adventure that failed so completely it was erased from the sagas and survived only in the chronicles of those who defeated them. Part 3. The Real Story. The morning of September 25th, 844 AD, brought an unfamiliar sight to the Guadalquivir River. 54 dragon-headed longships rowing steadily towards Seville. The Viking fleet had already spent weeks terrorizing the Atlantic coast of Iberia, burning mosques in Lisbon, raiding Cadiz, and plundering the countryside around Medina Sidonia. Now they aimed for the greatest prize in western Iberia, Seville, the ancient Roman city of Hispalis, third largest city in the Caliphate after Cordoba and Toledo. The Viking leaders, possibly including the semi-legendary Bjorn Ironside and Haystein, had good reason for confidence. Their intelligence, gathered from terrified coastal villages, suggested Seville was in chaos. The Emir Abd al-Rahman II was supposedly far away in Cordoba, dealing with internal rebellions. The city's garrison was undermanned. The wealth of Al-Andalus lay open for the taking. What the Vikings didn't know was that they were sailing into a carefully orchestrated trap. Abd al-Rahman II was indeed in Cordoba, but he was neither distracted nor unprepared. The moment Viking sails had been spotted passing Tarifa, the Rabat signal network had alerted the entire Andalusian defense system. While Vikings spent 3 weeks slowly raiding up the Atlantic coast, thinking they were spreading terror, they were actually giving the Caliphate time to mobilize. Letters preserved in the Cordoban archives show the emir's methodical response. Recall the fleet from Mediterranean patrols, gather the provincial cavalry, prepare the Greek fire vessels, and most importantly, let the Vikings commit themselves deep into Andalusian territory. The Vikings took Seville on October 1st, 844 AD. For 6 weeks, they thought they had won. They established camps on the river islands, raided the surrounding countryside, and accumulated massive stores of treasure and captives. Saga fragments speak vaguely of great victory in the south and wealth beyond counting. What they don't mention is that during those 6 weeks, Abd al-Rahman was assembling the most sophisticated military response the Vikings had ever faced. The Andalusian counterattack began on November 11th, 844 AD. It wasn't the kind of battle Vikings understood. Instead of shield walls and honourable combat, they faced a coordinated assault using weapons and tactics they had never encountered. The main Cordoban army, under the emir's personal command, advanced from the north with cavalry and infantry, but the killing blow would come from the river itself. The Andalusian fleet that appeared on the Guadalquivir that morning was unlike anything in Viking experience. These weren't converted merchant vessels or fishing boats pressed into military service. These were purpose-built war galleys, larger than Viking longships, with reinforced rams and elevated fighting platforms. Most terrifying of all, several carried the siphons and ceramic containers of Greek fire. The Battle of Tablada, fought on November 11th through 12th, 844 AD, was less a battle than a massacre. Viking longships, designed for speed and shallow water navigation, were trapped in the narrow river. When they tried to form their traditional defensive line, lashing ships together to create fighting platforms, the Greek fire turned those platforms into death traps. Liquid fire spread from ship to ship, impossible to extinguish. Vikings who jumped into the river found Muslim cavalry waiting on the banks. The Arabic chronicler Ibn al-Qutiyya, writing a generation later from survivor accounts, described the scene. "The Magyus tried to reach the sea, but our ships blocked the river. They tried to reach the land, but our cavalry lined the shores. The fire consumed their ships, as the sun consumes ice. Those who sought mercy received slavery. Those who sought battle received death." Of the 54 ships that had entered the Guadalquivir, perhaps 20 escaped to the open sea. The Vikings lost over 1,000 dead and at least 500 captured. The captured Vikings faced a peculiar fate that shows how comprehensively they had been defeated. Many were ransomed back to their compatriots, but others were retained as technical advisors, teaching the Caliphate about northern European shipbuilding and navigation. Some converted to Islam and joined the Caliph's guard. The beautiful blonde Viking women, so exotic to Andalusian eyes, commanded high prices in the slave markets of Cordoba. Within a generation, Norse blood had been absorbed into the population of Al-Andalus, but not through conquest as Vikings had intended. The psychological impact on the surviving Vikings was profound. For the first time, they had encountered an enemy that didn't just defeat them but humiliated them. There was no honor in burning to death on your own ship, no glory in being sold as a curiosity in foreign markets. The survivors who made it back to the Loire River bases in Francia brought tales that would reshape Viking strategy in the Mediterranean for generations. But if 844 AD was a defeat, what happened in 859 to 860 AD was a catastrophe. This second major Viking Mediterranean expedition was larger, better prepared, and more ambitious than the first. Led by Haystein, and possibly Bjorn Ironside again, the fleet numbered over 100 ships, carrying perhaps 6,000 warriors. They had learned some lessons from 844. Avoid fortified river cities. Strike quickly at multiple targets. Don't get trapped in narrow waters. What they hadn't learned was that the entire Western Mediterranean had been preparing for their return. The expedition began promisingly enough. After raiding along the Iberian Atlantic coast, they successfully passed through the Strait of Gibraltar and attacked the North African coast. Their target was Nekor, a prosperous but relatively isolated city in what's now northern Morocco. The Vikings landed successfully, overwhelmed the city's modest defences, and spent 8 days plundering. They collected massive amounts of gold, silver, and what they called blue men slaves, the indigenous Berbers who would become exotic curiosities in northern European slave markets. This apparent success was actually the beginning of their doom. While Vikings celebrated their victory in Nekor, the entire North African coast was mobilizing. The attack on Nekor had been observed, tracked, and reported through the Islamic intelligence network. By the time Vikings finished their plundering, Berber cavalry units were converging from the interior while naval squadrons moved to block their escape routes. The Berber response revealed another crucial Viking miscalculation. They had assumed that North African forces would be similar to the settled, urbanized armies of Europe, slow to mobilize, dependent on heavy equipment, vulnerable to rapid coastal raids. Instead, they encountered highly mobile cavalry forces that could cover vast distances at speeds that seemed impossible to Norse raiders accustomed to European military pace. The Berber light cavalry that responded to the Nekor raid were descendants of warriors who had conquered most of Iberia in just 3 years. They could ride 100 miles in a day, strike at dawn, and disappear into the desert before counterattack. When Vikings tried to return to their ships with their plunder and slaves, they found thousands of horsemen waiting. The battle on the beaches of Nekor was a massacre. Vikings, laden with plunder and trying to herd captives, were caught in the open by cavalry charges. Those who made it to their ships found that several had been burned by Berber raiders who had circled around their position. The narrow beach became a killing ground. Arabic sources claim 2,000 Vikings died in a single morning, though this may be exaggerated. The survivors fled across the strait, but their ordeal was just beginning. The Islamic naval response had been coordinated between Al-Andalus and the Maghreb. As Viking ships struggled north, they found combined Muslim fleets waiting. The engagement off the coast of Algeciras saw the first recorded use of coordinated fireship attacks against Vikings. Small, fast vessels loaded with naphtha and tar were set ablaze and directed into the Viking formation. In the confined waters of the strait, with strong currents and unfamiliar winds, Viking ships couldn't maneuver to avoid them. The Spanish Muslim chronicler Ibn Adari recorded, "The Marjus were caught between the fires of heaven and the swords of the faithful. Their ships burned like pine torches. The sea was covered with their shields and axes, thrown away as they tried to swim to shore. Of the 100 ships that had entered the Mediterranean, perhaps 60 survived to reach the Atlantic. But even this escape came at a price. The Vikings had lost not just ships and men, but their entire haul from Nekor. Most of the treasure and all of the slaves had to be abandoned in the flight. The expedition that was supposed to make them wealthy beyond dreams had turned into a financial catastrophe. Several of the surviving ships were so damaged they had to be abandoned on the Iberian Atlantic coast, their crews cramming onto the remaining vessels. The 859 to 860 expedition marked a turning point. Never again would Vikings attempt a major, coordinated invasion of the Mediterranean. But smaller groups, driven by desperation or ignorance of what had happened to their predecessors, continued to probe Mediterranean waters. Each attempt met the same fate. The forgotten raid of 966 AD demonstrates how completely Islamic forces had mastered anti-Viking operations. This raid, barely mentioned in Norse sources but extensively documented in Arabic chronicles, originated from Viking bases in Ireland. A fleet of 16 ships, probably seeking easier targets than the increasingly fortified English kingdoms, decided to try their luck in southern waters. They never even reached the Mediterranean proper. Al-Hakam II's coastal warning system detected them passing Cape St. Vincent. By the time they approached the Tagus River, hoping to repeat the 844 success at Lisbon, a combined fleet from Seville, Almeria, and even Ceuta was waiting. The battle, if it can be called that, lasted less than 3 hours. 13 Viking ships were destroyed. The 3 that escaped did so only by throwing their weapons and armour overboard to increase speed. What made 966 different was the preemptive nature of the Islamic response. They didn't wait for Vikings to attack and then respond. They intercepted them at sea, using superior intelligence and navigation to achieve tactical surprise. The Vikings, accustomed to being the surprisers, found themselves ambushed in open water by an enemy that knew exactly where they would be. The repeated Viking attempts on the Balearic Islands reveal the evolution of Islamic anti-Viking tactics. Between 860 and 1015 AD, at least 5 separate Viking expeditions tried to establish bases in Majorca and Minorca. The islands seemed perfect, wealthy enough to be worth raiding, isolated enough to avoid immediate counterattack, positioned to threaten both Islamic and Christian shipping. Every attempt failed, and each failure was more complete than the last. The first attempts in the 860s faced traditional naval resistance. By the 900s, the islands had developed specialized anti-Viking defenses. Coastal watchtowers could track approaching ships from beyond the horizon. Hidden artillery positions using tension catapults could target landing beaches. Most innovatively, the defenders had developed tactical deception techniques, creating false beaches that looked ideal for landing but led into killing zones. The 1015 AD attempt, the last recorded Viking expedition to the Balearics, didn't even achieve a landing. The 23-ship fleet was detected, tracked, and intercepted by a denier-based squadron that had been specifically maintained as an anti-Viking force. The engagement lasted a single afternoon. No Viking ships survived. The naval innovations Islamic forces developed specifically to counter Vikings revolutionized Mediterranean warfare. Greek fire gets the most attention, but it was just one element of a comprehensive technological advantage. The naphtha mixtures Islamic forces used were actually superior to Byzantine Greek fire in some ways. They added ingredients like sulfur and quicklime that made the fire stick better to wooden surfaces and burn even hotter. Some mixtures included additives that created toxic smoke, forcing Vikings to choose between burning and suffocating. The delivery systems were equally sophisticated. Beyond the traditional siphons that shot liquid fire, Islamic forces developed ceramic grenades that could be thrown by hand or launched from catapults. These grenades were designed to shatter on impact, spreading burning liquid across a ship's deck. Some were even designed with primitive time delays, using slow-burning fuses that would let them roll beneath rowing benches before exploding. But perhaps the most decisive innovation was tactical rather than technological. Islamic naval commanders developed what they called the moon formation, specifically designed to counter Viking linear tactics. Instead of meeting Vikings line to line, Islamic ships would form a crescent, allowing them to envelope Viking formations and attack from multiple angles simultaneously. Vikings, trained for single ship or line combat, had no effective counter to being surrounded and attacked from all sides. The speed differential was equally decisive. Viking longships were fast in northern waters, but Mediterranean galleys were faster in Mediterranean conditions. Islamic ships used lateen sails that could sail closer to the wind than Viking square sails. They had multiple banks of oars with trained crews that could maintain higher speeds for longer periods. Most crucially, they knew the local wind patterns, currents, and seasonal variations that Vikings had to learn through fatal trial and error. The intelligence advantage Islamic forces enjoyed cannot be overstated. While Vikings relied on local informants and direct observation, Islamic commanders had access to a sophisticated intelligence network that spanned the entire Mediterranean. Merchant ships served as informal scouts. Diplomatic missions gathered military intelligence. Even pilgrims traveling to Mecca reported on ship movements they observed. This intelligence network allowed Islamic forces to achieve something Vikings never could: strategic coordination across multiple powers. When Vikings threatened the Balearics, squadrons from Valencia, Denia, and North Africa could coordinate their response. When Vikings raided Morocco, warnings reached every port from Ceuta to Alexandria. The Mediterranean Muslims might fight among themselves, but against Viking threats, they presented a united front. The economic dimension of Islamic anti-Viking success is often overlooked. The wealth of cities like Cordoba and Cairo meant they could afford purpose-built military vessels rather than relying on converted merchant ships. They could maintain standing naval forces rather than assembling them ad hoc for each threat. They could invest in expensive technologies like Greek fire and maintain the specialized crews needed to operate them. When Vikings faced Islamic forces, they weren't just facing different tactics or technologies. They were facing the military expression of a fundamentally wealthier civilization. The human intelligence factor was equally important. By the 1000s, Islamic forces had extensive knowledge of Viking tactics, psychology, and limitations. Some of this knowledge came from captured Vikings who converted to Islam or served as military slaves. Some came from diplomatic contacts with European powers who also fought Vikings. Some came from careful study of Viking raids elsewhere. Islamic commanders knew Vikings preferred dawn attacks, so they scheduled patrols accordingly. They knew Vikings needed accessible beaches for landing, so they fortified or trapped such beaches. They knew Vikings relied on speed and surprise, so they eliminated both advantages through intelligence and interception. By the end of the Viking Age, the Mediterranean had become a graveyard for Norse ambitions. What had begun with dreams of easy wealth and conquest ended with consistent, humiliating defeat. The sophisticated Islamic powers of the Mediterranean had developed a complete system for defeating Viking raids. Intelligence to detect them, technology to destroy them, and tactics to counter them. The Vikings, who had terrorized much of Europe, found themselves reduced to cautionary tales in the markets of Cordoba and Cairo, their weapons sold as curiosities, their ships' dragonheads displayed as trophies, their dreams of Mediterranean empire as dead as their burned fleets. Part 4. Why it matters. The standard narrative of Viking expansion reads like a march of inevitable conquest. From Norwegian fjords to English kingdoms, from Swedish rivers to Russian principalities, from Iceland to Greenland to the shores of North America. In this telling, Vikings appear as an unstoppable force of history, superior warriors whose expansion was limited only by geography and their own choices. The Mediterranean story shatters this narrative completely. Here, Vikings weren't conquerors who chose when to stop. They were defeated raiders who were stopped. This reframing matters because it fundamentally changes how we understand Viking Age, Europe, and the broader medieval world. Vikings succeeded not because they were inherently superior warriors, but because they found and exploited specific vulnerabilities in specific societies. They thrived against politically fragmented regions with limited naval capabilities and poor communication networks. England, in the 800s, divided among warring kingdoms with almost no naval forces, was perfect Viking territory. The Mediterranean, in the 900s, dominated by sophisticated naval powers with extensive intelligence networks, was not. The technological dimension of Viking failure in the Mediterranean reveals something crucial about military history that often gets obscured by narratives of warrior prowess and battlefield courage. Technology wins wars. The Vikings who faced Greek fire weren't less brave than their fathers who conquered York. They weren't less skilled than their cousins establishing the Danelaw. They were simply outmatched by superior technology, deployed by a civilization that had been perfecting naval warfare for centuries. This technological gap wasn't just about weapons. It encompassed navigation, ship design, logistics, and communication. While Vikings were navigating by sun, compass, and coastal landmarks, Islamic navigators were using astrolabes and magnetic needles. While Vikings were building ships for rivers and beaches, Islamic shipwrights were designing vessels for open ocean combat. While Viking raids depended on surprise, Islamic signal networks could track their movements across hundreds of miles. The Vikings didn't lose because they fought badly. They lost because they were fighting a fundamentally unwinnable technological mismatch. Consider what this means for our understanding of the Viking Age itself. The Great Viking expansion coincided not with some inherent Nordic superiority, but with a temporary power vacuum in Western Europe following the collapse of Carolingian authority and the absence of effective naval forces in the Atlantic. When Vikings encountered organized states with comparable or superior military technology, whether the unified England of Alfred the Great or the Islamic powers of the Mediterranean, their expansion stopped cold. The psychological impact of Mediterranean defeats on Viking culture has been largely erased from popular memory, but traces survive in the archaeological record and saga literature. The absence of Mediterranean raids in skaldic poetry, the genre that celebrated Viking victories, is deafening. Skalds composed elaborate verses about raids on England, Ireland, and Francia, but the Mediterranean expeditions that involved thousands of warriors and hundreds of ships merit barely a mention. This wasn't accidental forgetting, it was deliberate erasure of shameful memory. The strategic implications of Viking failure in the Mediterranean shaped the entire course of European history. Unable to establish themselves in the wealthy Mediterranean, Vikings focused their expansion into the Atlantic and Eastern Europe. This westward and eastward orientation, forced by Mediterranean failure, created the economic and cultural networks that would define medieval Europe. The Viking Age as we know it, with its emphasis on Atlantic expansion and Eastern European trade routes, was shaped by the hard barrier of Islamic naval power in the south. Yet despite the military failures, cultural exchange between Vikings and the Islamic Mediterranean did occur, just not in the way Vikings intended. The thousands of Vikings captured in failed Mediterranean raids didn't simply disappear. Many were incorporated into Islamic societies as military slaves, the Mamluks, who would become a crucial military caste in Islamic civilization. These Norse warriors brought knowledge of northern European military techniques, shipbuilding methods, and geographical information that Islamic powers used to understand and sometimes interact with the European world. The transfer went both directions. Vikings who survived Mediterranean encounters brought back more than just tales of defeat. They brought knowledge of advanced navigation techniques, new weapon designs, and perhaps most importantly, an understanding that the world contained civilizations far more sophisticated than anything in Northern Europe. The humility forced on Vikings by Mediterranean defeats may have contributed to their eventual willingness to adopt Christianity and integrate into European civilization, rather than simply raiding it. The economic implications were equally profound. Viking failure to access Mediterranean wealth directly forced them to develop alternative trade routes. The great Eastern European river routes that Vikings developed, connecting Scandinavia to Constantinople and Baghdad through Russia, were in many ways a response to being locked out of the direct Mediterranean trade. The Vikings became middlemen rather than raiders, traders rather than conquerors, because the Mediterranean option had been closed to them by Islamic naval power. The intelligence networks that Islamic powers developed to track and defeat Vikings didn't disappear when the Viking threat diminished. These systems evolved into the sophisticated intelligence apparatus that would give Islamic powers advantages in later conflicts, including the Crusades. The coastal warning systems, rapid communication networks, and coordinated naval responses developed for anti-Viking operations became permanent features of Islamic military organization. For the Islamic world, successfully defeating Vikings validated their military superiority and reinforced their control of Mediterranean trade. The wealth that Vikings failed to plunder continued to flow through Islamic hands, funding the cultural and scientific achievements of the Islamic Golden Age. The libraries of Cordoba, the observatories of Cairo, the medical schools of Damascus were all funded by the wealth that Vikings had tried and failed to steal. The technological innovations developed to defeat Vikings had lasting impacts on naval warfare. Greek fire and its Islamic variants continued to dominate naval combat for centuries. The tactical formations developed to counter Viking attacks influenced Mediterranean naval doctrine through the Renaissance. Even the intelligence-gathering methods pioneered during the Viking Age became standard practice for Mediterranean powers, contributing to the sophisticated espionage networks of medieval and early modern Europe. Modern military historians studying asymmetric warfare find remarkable parallels between Islamic anti-Viking operations and contemporary naval strategies. The use of intelligence networks to track enemy movements, the deployment of advanced technology to neutralize numerical advantages, the coordination of multiple forces to concentrate against dispersed raiders, all these are strategies that modern navies employ against pirates and non-state actors. The Islamic response to Vikings was, in many ways, one of history's first successful counterinsurgency naval campaigns. The danger of believing your own propaganda is another lesson the Viking Mediterranean defeats teach us. Vikings had developed a fearsome reputation that served them well in psychological warfare. The sight of dragon-headed ships often caused defenders to flee before combat even began. But this reputation became a liability in the Mediterranean, where Islamic forces had accurate intelligence about Viking capabilities and limitations. The mythology of Viking invincibility, so effective in terrorizing isolated monasteries, meant nothing to commanders who had studied Viking tactics and developed specific counters. The role of economic disparity in military conflict is starkly illustrated by Viking failures in the Mediterranean. Vikings could successfully raid societies at similar economic levels, extracting wealth through superior tactics or temporary advantages. But when they encountered a civilization significantly wealthier than their own, the economic advantage translated directly into military superiority. Islamic powers could afford better weapons, larger fleets, and standing armies that Vikings simply couldn't match. The gold Vikings sought in the Mediterranean was precisely what funded the forces that defeated them. For our understanding of medieval Islamic civilization, the Viking encounters provide crucial evidence of military sophistication, often overlooked in Western narratives. The Islamic powers that defeated Vikings weren't the decadent, declining civilization of Orientalist imagination. They were dynamic, innovative, and militarily superior to their European contemporaries. The ease with which they handled the Viking threat that terrorized Christian Europe demonstrates the real balance of power in the medieval world. The environmental and geographical factors in Viking defeats remind us that military success is always contextual. Viking longships that dominated northern European waters were liabilities in the Mediterranean. Viking tactics perfected for river raids and beach assaults failed against enemies expecting them. The seasonal weather patterns Vikings relied on in the Atlantic worked against them in the Mediterranean. Military superiority is never absolute. It's always relative to specific conditions and specific opponents. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Viking defeats in the Mediterranean challenges us to question historical narratives that have been shaped by the victors, or in this case, by the defeated who controlled the narrative. For centuries, European historians have told the story of the Viking Age from an exclusively Northern European perspective, creating an image of Viking invincibility that the Mediterranean evidence completely contradicts. The full story, incorporating Arabic sources and archaeological evidence, reveals Vikings not as unstoppable forces of history, but as opportunistic raiders who succeeded where conditions favored them and failed catastrophically where they didn't. The lessons extend beyond military history into our understanding of cultural contact and exchange. The Viking Islamic encounters in the Mediterranean weren't just military conflicts. They were collisions between different worldviews, technologies, and ways of understanding the world. The Vikings discovered that their gods, their weapons, and their way of war meant nothing against Greek fire and coordinated fleets. This kind of comprehensive civilizational defeat forces adaptation or extinction. The Vikings adapted, eventually becoming Christian Europeans rather than pagan raiders, partly because the Mediterranean taught them the limits of their own culture. The story also reminds us of the danger of single-perspective history. If we only had Norse sagas, we might believe Vikings successfully raided the Mediterranean and returned with treasure. If we only had Arabic chronicles, we might think Vikings were minor pirates easily swatted aside. The full story, synthesizing multiple sources and archaeological evidence, reveals a more complex narrative of ambitious raids meeting sophisticated defense, of two civilizations learning from their encounters even as they fought, of historical forces being shaped by conflicts most people have forgotten. Understanding why Vikings failed in the Mediterranean helps us understand why they succeeded elsewhere, and why their age eventually ended. They were not destined conquerors following inevitable historical trajectories. They were adaptive raiders who succeeded in specific conditions and failed when those conditions changed. The Mediterranean, with its advanced civilizations, superior technology, and coordinated defenses, represented a future where Viking methods simply didn't work. Eventually, that future would reach Northern Europe too, ending the Viking Age not through conquest but through obsolescence. Conclusion: the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo displays the magnificent Oseberg ship, the Gokstad ship, and other monuments to Norse maritime achievement. These vessels, recovered from royal burial mounds, speak to Viking mastery of shipbuilding and navigation. But there are no Viking ships recovered from the Mediterranean seafloor displayed in museums, no proud monuments to raids on Seville or Almeria. Those ships burned to the waterline, their dragon heads consumed by Greek fire, their crews scattered to slave markets or hasty graves. The ships that survive are the ones that sailed safer waters, attacked weaker enemies, and made it home to tell their stories. This selective preservation of history matters more than we might think. For generations, Western civilization has told itself a story about the Viking Age that is at best incomplete and at worst deliberately misleading. We've created a narrative where Vikings appear as forces of historical inevitability, expanding wherever they chose until they decided to settle down and become Christians. The Mediterranean story reveals this narrative as fantasy. Vikings expanded where they could, not where they chose. They stopped being Vikings not because they evolved beyond raiding, but because the world evolved beyond their ability to raid it successfully. The price of this forgotten history extends beyond simple inaccuracy. By erasing Viking defeats from popular memory, we've created a distorted understanding of the medieval world itself. We imagine medieval Europe as the center of military innovation and martial prowess, with Viking raiders as its ultimate expression. The reality that Islamic civilization possessed superior military technology, better organizational capacity, and more sophisticated tactical doctrine disrupts comfortable narratives about Western superiority that stretch from the Middle Ages to the present day. Even more importantly, forgetting the forces that stopped Viking expansion robs us of crucial historical lessons. The nameless Moorish sailors who manned the fireships at Tablada, the Berber cavalry who rode down Viking raiders on Moroccan beaches, the engineers who designed the signal networks that tracked Viking movements. These people shaped European history just as surely as Charlemagne or Alfred the Great. They determined where Viking expansion would stop, which trade routes would develop, how Northern European civilization would evolve. Yet their names appear in no popular histories, their achievements celebrated in no television dramas. The real Viking legacy, understood properly, is not one of unstoppable conquest, but of remarkable adaptation within specific constraints. Vikings succeeded brilliantly in exploiting the political fragmentation and military weaknesses of 900s Europe. They developed innovative tactics for riverine warfare, perfected the art of strategic mobility, and created trading networks that connected diverse cultures across thousands of miles. These were genuine achievements that shaped medieval Europe, but they were achievements with clear limits, and the Mediterranean defined those limits in fire and blood. Vikings were ultimately opportunists, not conquerors. They raided where raiding was profitable and possible. They traded where trading was safer than raiding. They settled where local powers were too weak to expel them, and they avoided places where the cost of raiding exceeded any possible benefit. The Mediterranean, after 844 AD, became one of those places, not because Vikings chose to avoid it, but because Islamic naval power made that choice for them. Understanding Vikings as adaptive opportunists rather than destined conquerors also helps us understand why the Viking Age ended. It wasn't because Scandinavians suddenly became peaceful Christians, though Christianity certainly played a role. It was because the conditions that made Viking raiding possible gradually disappeared. European kingdoms developed better defenses, built naval forces, created intelligence networks. The military innovations that gave Islamic powers such decisive advantages gradually spread northward. By the time of the Battle of Hastings in 1066 AD, the age of Viking raiding was effectively over because Europe had evolved beyond vulnerability to their tactics. The advanced civilization that defeated Vikings in the Mediterranean deserves recognition not as exotic Oriental despots, but as sophisticated military powers that shaped European development through their very success. The Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, that coordinated the response to Viking raids, was one of the most advanced civilizations of its era, with libraries larger than any in Christian Europe, cities more populous than any north of the Alps, and scientific knowledge that wouldn't reach European universities for centuries. Reducing these civilizations to mere pirates or raiders, as some Western histories still do, is historical malpractice that distorts our understanding of the medieval world and its development. The story of Viking defeats in the Mediterranean ultimately teaches us about the importance of multiple perspectives in understanding history. Every civilization writes its own story, emphasizing its victories and minimizing its defeats. The Norse sagas celebrated Viking victories while forgetting Mediterranean disasters. Arabic chronicles recorded defensive successes while paying little attention to Viking achievements elsewhere. Only by combining these perspectives, adding archaeological evidence, and analyzing what each side chose to remember or forget, can we approach something like historical truth. The Mediterranean that defeated Viking expansion wasn't an empty sea waiting for northern raiders to bring it history. It was a complex, sophisticated maritime environment where multiple civilizations had been competing and innovating for 1,000 years before the first Viking ship passed Gibraltar. The Islamic powers that controlled its waters weren't accidentally or temporarily superior to Vikings. They were systematically, technologically, and organizationally more advanced in naval warfare. Vikings didn't fail in the Mediterranean because of bad luck or poor timing. They failed because they encountered a superior military system that they could neither defeat nor adapt to quickly enough. As we retell the story of the Viking Age, we owe it to historical accuracy and to the descendants of all participants to tell the complete story, not just the raids that succeeded, but the ones that failed. Not just the Vikings who became kings, but the ones who became slaves. Not just the dragon ships that returned home, but the ones that burned on foreign waters. And certainly not just the Christian European perspective, but also the Islamic, the Byzantine, the Slavic, and all the others who encountered and sometimes defeated Viking expansion. The true story of Vikings in the Mediterranean is not one of barbaric raiders meeting civilized defenders, nor of noble warriors facing treacherous enemies. It's a story of two sophisticated military systems meeting in conflict, with one proving decisively superior. It's a story of technological advantage, strategic intelligence, and economic power determining military outcomes. It's a story of historical forces being shaped not by destiny or divine will, but by concrete factors like ship design, communication speed, and weapons technology. Most of all, it's a reminder that history is never as simple as our stories make it seem. The Vikings of popular imagination, invincible warriors expanding by right of conquest, never existed. The real Vikings were complex historical actors operating within specific constraints and possibilities. Their successes were real but contextual. Their failures were decisive but forgotten. And their legacy is not one of inevitable triumph, but of human adaptation to changing historical circumstances. The Mediterranean they couldn't conquer stands as permanent testimony to the limits of their power and the sophistication of those who stopped them.